Good morning. How's everyone doing? I know folks may continue to filter in, but we'll kind of slowly get started. I'd like to invite anyone who wants to move up, especially so that when folks filter in, they can squeeze into some of those back rows without having to walk in front of everybody who's already seated. My name's Sasha. I work at HCD. I oversee our program design and implementation team. And we have been working as a team to implement the requirements of AB 434, the multifamily finance Supernofa. So I'm really excited to talk to you about it today. We just released our NOFA and our final guidelines a couple days ago. So maybe a couple of you have already had a chance to dig in and you'll have questions in the weeds for us. Others may have less background in HCD funding and might have more questions about the basics. And so I want to make space for both ends of the spectrum here. Let me see by show of hands who is with an affordable housing developer that has applied previously for HCD funds. Okay, so that's kind of the majority of the room. Who has read either guidelines or NOFA materials for this current multifamily finance Supernofa or a previous iteration of the multifamily housing program? Okay. All right, so I'm sort of among experts here. If you're not an expert, don't be shy. You can ask me to unpack acronyms. None of us should be using as many acronyms anyway. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process to get us here, first of all, to kind of pat ourselves on the back for doing quite an extensive outreach and feedback process. This AB 434 was not of our making, but we've really embraced the goal of this, which is to streamline our funding sources for affordable rental development. We have had 2 public comment periods and many, many stakeholder meetings in small groups, of course, many one-on-one exchanges as well. And we've also been working closely with our partners at the other housing finance agencies, Select, TCEC, and HCD, to align as much as possible in our definitions and our requirements so that developers who are moving from HCD funding to Select and TCEC especially have a clearer pathway and don't have to unravel minutia that don't exactly align across our programs and Select and TCEC. So I hope that you will see that when you do have a chance to dig into the NOFA and guidelines. It's not something that jumps into the news as like, wow, the definitions are the same now, but it really does make a big difference. And this beauty of PowerPoint formatting is to tell a little bit of the story about why streamlining is important. So this is a real project. It's a 79-unit homeless housing project with 20 large family units, 3 bedrooms or larger. It came in first for HCD funding, for MHP presumably with some local support already. In June of 2019, they were successful in that competition. Later in 2019 came in for IIG and were again successful. I don't have records of the number of programs that this project applied to and was not successful for, but you can imagine there may be some in here. Particularly because they didn't get their next kind of round of HCD funding until 2021, where they came in for round 4 TOD. All this time, this project is trying to get complete, right? They're trying to fill their gap. Years are going by. They eventually enter the 4% tax credit round in round 2 of last year, are unsuccessful, and wind up receiving an award from our accelerator program. So this project is ready to move forward now with their accelerator award. But that path to complete gap financing took 2.5 years, and we are hoping that with this multifamily finance Supernofa, we're going to cut that down to about 6 months. So that's the goal. What is it, really? Please come on in, take a seat, don't be shy. So the statute requires us to revise and align the program guidelines for 6 of our multifamily development programs and 2 of our single-family development programs. I'm focusing today on our multifamily programs, but we will be issuing a single-family or homeownership Supernofa later this year for those of you who are interested in homeownership. 2 of these programs, the Transit-Oriented Development Program and the Housing for Healthy California Program, do not have funds available this year. So they're not included in this Supernofa, but we do have funding for MHP, VHHP, CERNA, and IIG. MHP is sort of our vanilla, most flexible multifamily development finance program. CERNA provides funds specifically for farm worker housing. VIP provides funds specifically for veterans, particularly homeless and chronically homeless veterans. And IIG provides funding for infrastructure rather than the building-specific capital. So anything that you need to get the building built that's sewer, streets, transit can be funded through IIG. All of these now are issued together. We have consolidated the rating and ranking into a single scoring system. We've moved all of the program-specific criteria to threshold. So if you are coming in for VIP, you'll need to make sure that you're meeting all of the threshold requirements, demonstrating that you are in fact capable of serving a veteran population. And we're then going to rank according to a single ranked list and fund down the list, aiming to fully fund as many projects as possible, fully gap fund rather. I know many projects are going to go on to Select and TCAC for the remainder, with a one-stop application that's coming out in April 20th. So here are the total funds that are going to be available. We have about $650 million under these 4 programs. And within this $650 million, we have a few different targets and set-asides to achieve our policy goals, one of them being equitable access. We have a 5% set-aside for tribal entities. We also have 2 new categories of developers that I will describe momentarily for a total of 15% set-aside. Within that 15% set-aside, we are prioritizing emerging or less experienced developers for part of that pot. And then we're trying to encourage folks to be fully gap funded with us and not need to go on to Select and TCAC, because we know that we are continually recreating a bit of a backlog and a wait time for tax credits. And so for smaller projects and projects that can manage to move forward with HCD funding without tax credits or bonds, we hope that they will consider using our non-tax credit set-aside. And according to statute, we also have a 20% set aside for senior projects under the MHP program. So here are our emerging developer and community-based developer definitions. The goal here is really to acknowledge that we've somewhat created by virtue of valuing experience and valuing high degree of demonstrated excellence. We've created an inner circle of developers who can consistently win in our competitions, but that also blocks out diversity, it blocks out innovation, it blocks out smaller developers. And so we are trying to chip away at that while also ensuring that we as a department are responsible with state funds, right? We're risk averse. But we do have an emerging developer category for those newer developers who have at least one development under their belt, either as their current entity or with a prior development organization, and still won't max out their experience points, right? So community-based developers are different. They're folks who are rooted in community, sort of your typical CDC, often providing services, having multiple affordable housing developments within a smaller geography, neighborhood, community. We are looking at this as sort of an alternative pathway for folks who might not score well under our high and highest opportunity area points. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that has been a balancing act for the state to acknowledge that we need to rebalance our portfolio by putting more of our investment into places that have great schools, great parks, great access to jobs, but also acknowledging that a lot of those metrics tend to correlate with income and race. And so by doing that, we are sometimes preventing lower income communities of color from having access to our funding. And this is an attempt to balance out that highest opportunity designation. So for these emerging and community-based developers, we've tried to set up a sort of multiple pathways to success. We have incentives for partnership. So either category, as well as tribal entities, can apply as a co-applicant or a joint venture with a more experienced developer and use that developer's experience to gain points in the competition. We also then are requiring those folks who are using their partner's development experience to actually have a genuine partnership where they are sharing the developer fee and cash flow equally, where they're actually receiving technical assistance and training from that more experienced partner in earnest, and where the partner is required to stay in the project for a certain period of time, but that the lesser experienced partner also has a right to purchase after they are up to speed. So opt-in to purchase when the experienced developer exits is built in as well. We have created some incentives for more experienced developers to want to engage in these types of partnerships. Not only are we requiring an equal split in developer fee and cash flow, but also we're increasing our loan limits and our allowable developer fee for these types of partnerships, particularly with emerging developers and tribal entities. So the bottom two bullets are not applicable to community-based developers because a lot of those folks already have quite a lot of experience and don't necessarily need that added incentive for partnership. Tribal entities, we've also been trying for the past couple of years to open the door to invite more tribal entities to apply for HCD funds and to make that possible by providing more technical assistance and explanation, outreach workshops. It has been a rocky road sometimes because our programs have not been built for the needs of tribes and tribal entities. We are continuing to try, and we have made a lot of adjustments in our guidelines in NOFA to make it easier for tribes with their existing resources and rules to be able to make use of our funds. We're also providing technical assistance from the pre-application phase through development in the hopes that we might be able to provide some of that added support. We have a 5% set aside within the NOFA, and tribal entities do have multiple ways to gain those experience points. I'm not going to go into the details, but if you are part of a tribe or a tribal entity interested in applying, please take advantage of the pre-application consultation opportunity, and we can go into depth on that. Geographic targets, as per usual, we do have geographic targets to achieve an overarching equitable distribution of our awards. This is based partially on the distribution of cost-burdened renters in the state, and also looking at historically what has worked for HCD programs. So this is not a wild deviation from what we've done under MHP and our other multifamily programs in the past. But we are slightly adjusted to have a little bit more discretionary funds. This does not add up to 100%, it adds up to 90%. So we have 10% that we can use according to where the highest scoring applications are coming in, since we are not exactly sure. But we also are moving in a direction of having just slightly more allocation to the southern as opposed to the northern, because there is an increasing numbers of cost-burdened renters in the southern part of the state. One sort of side note for those who may not already know is that the rural 18% set aside is not restricted only to rurally designated counties. There are also rural parts of non-rural counties. And so many of our rural projects come in from one of these counties that is listed here in a northern or southern region, but they are in fact in a rural part of that county. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the way that we are going to rank and fund, because you can imagine, hey, with all of these different policy priorities, all of these different targets and set-asides, who gets the first bite at the apple? How are you going to ensure that as funds run out, you're kind of maximizing full gap funding rather than leaving people with a partial gap? We have attempted to do that to the greatest extent possible. Our goals for The way that we are funding down the list are to reduce fund stacking so that folks don't have a huge incentive to come in for 2 or 3 or 4 HCD programs. If you can get the same amount of money under one, great. We also want to streamline the award and underwriting process, which again ties back to if you can make do with one award, a CERNA, max out on your CERNA or max out on your VHHP, don't come in for 3 different things, that makes the whole thing move faster for everyone. We absolutely know that we need to minimize partially funded projects because there aren't a lot of other resources out there to get folks lined up for the SELEC and TCAT competition. As I mentioned, MHP is our kind of most popular, most highly competitive program, and so we wanted to make sure that combining MHP with these 3 other funding sources didn't create a mad rush on MHP while leaving VHHP, CERNA, and IIG undersubscribed. So we've created incentives, particularly for VHHP and CERNA applicants. But of course, we want to ensure that there is a high standard of quality across all different types of projects, so all of them are scored according to the same set of standards. So the way that we're going to do it, right, is we'll get in all of the applications by our deadline, June 28th. We'll do the threshold review to make sure that projects pass the threshold requirements for all of the funding sources that they're applying for. Then we'll move to scoring. We'll do the universal scoring on every project and the tiebreaker where needed. Gina, in the second part of our presentation, is going to go into great detail on exactly what those scoring criteria are and why they are the way they are. So I know a lot of folks are going to be really interested in that piece of it. I'm not quite there yet, though. We are then going to fully fund the set-asides. So that is tribal entities, emerging developers, community-based developers, and non-tax credit projects. Then we will go to projects that have at least 25% VHHP and CERNA units and fund down those lists according to who is the top scoring within those 2 buckets. Then we will get to the rest of the list and we will fund to maximize geographic equity according to our targets. A lot of folks are asking, hey, what happens if you have an overwhelming ask for MHP or an overwhelming ask for CERNA and you have a highly scored project but you've run out of CERNA. Now, the state has now run out of CERNA. Well, generally, we are going to skip that project. We need to make sure that projects are financially feasible. We are generally the last stop before going to SELEC and TCAT. And so unless that project can show us that they can fill their remaining gap within 6 months, we're going to skip down to a next project on the list that wouldn't be partially funded. We're also requiring that all projects need to secure complete financing, including their tax credits and bonds if they're going in within 24 months. So this is all an effort to keep projects breaking ground as quickly as possible, and those that are ultimately not going to be successful, we have to disencumber and move that money into a project that's going to be able to move forward. We're doing something a little bit differently with loan maximums under AB 434, and this is really all for the purpose of removing the incentive to apply for every program under the sun, which I know makes everyone crazy. We have an existing anti-stacking rule that only allows 2 loans and 2 grants per affordable housing project of HCD sources, right? 2 HCD loans and 2 HCD grants. We also now, under the multifamily finance Supernofa, have a per project loan max of $35 million, and we have a per unit loan limits that have been based upon the MHP table of loan limits, unit loan limits. It's complicated. It varies by location, by unit size, by depth of affordability. And all of that, those calculations will be in our application document itself, but we have boosted up the per unit loan limits so that you get 1 per unit loan limit regardless of the number of programs that you're coming in at, right? You don't get an MHP max and then also a CERNA max on top of that. We also have per sponsor funding limits. Again, an effort to diversify the field, get more folks in the door, make space for higher scoring applications that aren't necessarily from a very small subset of excellent, wonderful partners. So we have an $80 million per sponsor funding limit that includes both loans and grants that would go to that sponsor under this particular Supernofa round. Partnerships, however, sort of slightly obscured, but partnerships with emerging and tribal developers are excluded from that limit. So we hope that experienced developers that do have great project ideas or interested in great project ideas might seek partnership in order to go ahead and do that without hitting the loan max. So now I am going to pass the mic to Gina Ferguson, my wonderful colleague who has been really the architect of our AB 434 NOFA and guidelines in great degree. So thank you, Gina.
Thank you, Sasha, very much, and thanks everyone for being here. Sasha has been integral to this entire process, and we wouldn't be where we are without her, so I just wanted to thank her and know that as we go forward, we are here to answer questions. As Sasha said, there's a lot of new information and a lot of variety in folks coming to our program, but we are available. We're here for questions now. We have folks ready through email communications, and our website's up and running, so I encourage you. If this is all new to you, please do go to the website, dive into the NOFA and the guidelines, and we are here to answer those questions. So just before we start into the different scoring categories, which is the focus of the remainder of the presentation, we just wanted to highlight that where we started when considering what to do. We did start with MHP, the multifamily housing program, as the base, and a lot of what is in there comes from the scoring criteria that was in existence, so we haven't tried to completely overhaul it. But with the goals that are up here, you can see that they are throughout the scoring. So we have incentives in the state policies for homeless. As Sasha mentioned, we are looking for equitable funding across different developer types, tribal, community-based, and emerging developers. You'll see some of that in the scoring, and I'll touch on the highlights going in the next few slides. Location-based opportunities. High and highest resource areas do receive points up to a 50% cap, and I'll go into that. So we're trying to balance, as we mentioned, incentivizing development in high and highest resource areas, but not pushing everyone to feel like they have to, every site that you need to acquire going forward to be competitive needs to be in a high and highest resource area. We're really looking for a balance there, as I think our other state housing agency or housing finance partners are doing as well. We have categories also for sustainable development and cost containment, and so I will proceed and let you know what those are. This is a table of all of our scoring categories and what the options are for those, and the next few slides I'll be going over each one and hitting the highlights of these. What we've done, one of the things we've done before I move on is that particularly in the 21-point category and the state policies priority is we're looking, we understand that in many cases when a program is highly competitive, people really work to maximize the points so that almost all applicants are receiving maximum points, and then you move to a tiebreaker situation. So we've started in these point categories to kind of carve out places where maybe not every project is going to be able to maximize that point category, and that's okay. We want some variety, and we don't want everything to hang on the tiebreaker. We'd like, the points categories that we're selecting here and presenting to be more of the determining factor, as well as the distributions and the targetings that Sasha went over earlier. So, and before I get into some specifics of the different categories, one of the things that multiple categories do is look for depth of affordability. So we have a scoring category specifically that I'll talk about in the next slide, which is the lowest income level category. And that is aligned with CIDLAC and TCAC scoring category, but we also have in our tiebreaker an affordability measure. So we're looking in a couple of different places for depth of affordability. as well as in the state policy priorities category, we have some incentives there in terms of types and affordability of housing. Wanted to highlight too that in terms of quality of services, there's a variety among the programs, but we tried to establish a base. We really felt it was important that we have in the variety of projects that might come in, we may have some special needs focused projects. We certainly will have some veterans supportive housing focused projects. But for those who aren't utilizing those programs, we wanted to have just some basic quality of services on site. And so we've used the CIDLAC and TCAC services as a model, and so this is a threshold requirement, so please, you won't find that in scoring, you'll find it in the threshold, in the guidelines, specifically the individual guidelines that'll be in the threshold areas. So, but we aren't trying to reinvent the wheel, so we're using the same model and categories that you will see in the CIDLAC and TCAC competitions in terms of after-school programs, adult education, those types of things, service coordinator, and so really looking for just some good basic quality on-site services for all projects. And then, as I mentioned, for those that are doing special needs in the multifamily housing program, there are some very specific parameters in terms of the services that go along with those projects, and you'll find those in the MHP guidelines. And then for VHHP, the Veterans Housing and Homeless, those have some, those have this very robust supportive service requirements as well. And as Sasha mentioned, some of those were previously in the VHHP scoring. Those have now moved to the threshold, so you'll find those in the guidelines there. Also, we're really starting to think about how our program can address preservation projects. We know that there's a big push for new construction, and we have a lot of need in terms of building new units, but we also want to be sure that we are maintaining and preserving the projects that are already affordable, and so that those are a place for folks can go and stay. And so in our guidelines, we have looked to ensuring that everyone is aware of the relocation law requirements that go along, and that for projects that are preservation projects, there are noticing requirements for those tenants and protections, and we're just going to be sure that as we look at those plans and proposals that they're robust enough and they have adequate preventions in place to make sure that we're not displacing tenants at the same time that we're renovating projects. Because if you have some experience, sometimes that does happen. Someone will, with the best of intentions, come and renovate the project, but if there's some different income layering that comes along with some new funding sources, it can sometimes put existing projects or existing tenants in jeopardy of being able to stay in those units. So we're being really thoughtful about that. We've taken some steps in these guidelines, and we're definitely going to keep continuing on with that. So into the nitty-gritty of the scoring categories. Serving lowest income levels, if you're familiar with the multifamily housing program and the CIDLAC and TCAC programs, this has a similarity, very similar. There is a minimum 10% of your units required to be at 30% of area median income, so we're looking to make sure that at the very basic we have some real depth of affordability. And then you've got a wonderful grid, which the 9% TCAC 9% program uses. The multifamily housing program is used in the past, and so there's a range from 50% AMI to 20% AMI for our program in which you can receive points. You can go up to 55% AMI for rural projects, similar to what you've seen in the past with that grid. We are also, for the next category, addressing state policy priorities. That has a few different components, including a component that prioritizes homeless, special needs, or agricultural workers. So I know I'm jumping around, but I'm trying to stay with the theme of affordability. So within the state policy priorities, there are points for high and highest resource area, but there's an additional layer of points for projects that are committing to if you want to maximize those points, if you'll commit to 25% of your assisted units being either special needs, homeless, or farm worker, agricultural worker. And we did cut that off and intentionally and stop the points at 25%. It may seem a little low to some folks, but we are really trying to balance ongoing operational viability with deep affordability. We know that there's only a limited number of project-based vouchers or operating subsidy or those types of subsidies ongoing operationally that are needed to sustain really deeply affordable units. So this is a start. We're continuing to think about that. We feel like we have made a good start, and we are trying to balance these two. That's not to say that we don't at all encourage folks, if you have that ability and you can obtain those vouchers, there are things in the categories, which I'll go over in a bit, that incentivizes those projects as well. But we also want to be sure that we have balance between the different types of projects across the geographic regions and also the depth of affordability across. We're trying to serve all. All right, and so also within the state policy priorities, as Sasha mentioned, we are prioritizing high and highest resource areas. So we do have points for projects in those areas, but at a certain point in the ranking, those points will cease to be a competitive advantage. So we are using 50% in terms of once we go through that ranking, those points for high and highest resource areas, once we have filled a certain percent of the NOFA, 50% of the NOFA funds with high and highest resource area projects, those points cease to be a competitive advantage. So then after that point in the ranking, all projects are on a level playing field. Doesn't mean that high and highest resource area projects won't get funded within that, those remaining funds. It just means that they won't have a particular priority above other projects. So really trying to balance, as Sasha mentioned, incentivizing this, making sure we have more distribution in terms of areas of where our projects are going, but also not trying to push folks into feeling like to be competitive, they have to cite everything in a highest resource area. And I did want to say, too, that we are continuing to look at the methodology, along with TCAC, of how high and highest resource areas are incentivized. I think we've had lots of conversations with stakeholders and internally about the use for the maps. They're very valuable. We find that they're doing a lot of what they were intended, but we've heard your feedback about alternatives and other ways maybe to think about geographic distribution and priorities and opportunities. So in the next few years, we'll definitely be working on that, and we've got core teams focused on it right now. So just wanted to get that in there in case we have some questions coming up, percolating in your mind about that. Let's see. And so also within the state policies, we have a at high risk exception for special needs targeting. What we're doing is we want to make sure that there is a path for rehabilitation projects within state policy priorities. And so the component that I talked about, where you get points for up to 25% of your project being homeless, special needs, or farm worker, if you are a existing project coming in for rehabilitation funding, you do receive some automatic points in this category. And I don't want to get too much in the technical weeds, so I encourage you to look at the NOFA and read that. But the intent is to not, again, displace tenants. We don't want folks looking at a project that really needs funding and could be competitive through the system, but really feeling like, oh, I have to meet this particular percentage of special needs or homeless. I have existing tenants, they may not qualify for that, and we really are trying to discourage that decision making about really thinking about relocating tenants. So unless a project already has those types of restrictions, you can receive points in the state policy priorities just for being a rehabilitation project and not necessarily having to do a certain percent of those types of units. So again, it's trying to do a balancing act here. Okay, so the next couple of scoring categories, if you're familiar with affordable housing, these are familiar to you. Development and ownership experience, we are looking for a certain level of experience in not only development and ownership, but also in property management. We have aligned as closely as possible with the CIDLAC and TCAC experience categories just for streamline and alignment and ease of use across the different programs. In addition to, and part of that is paths for tribal, emerging, and community-based developers. So those systems already do have pathways for tribal entities that may not be interested in co-ownership with an outside entity that's not a tribal entity. There is still a path to use past tribal experience. And if you aren't quite up there in terms of the threshold that is set for ownership, it's 5 projects, and for property management, it's 11 past projects. So if a tribal entity can't quite make that, they'd have the ability to contract with a developer that doesn't have an ownership interest in that. Just trying to, in our research and outreach with folks, we understood that this was a priority for some tribal entities. So that is in these guidelines. And then emerging and community-based developers, there are paths for lesser points or for co-partnership. So emerging developers can partner with an experienced developer and receive full points. But as Sasha mentioned, there is an emerging and community-based developer set aside. And so there is a way for emerging developers with a certain minimum level of experience that may not meet these points. They do have an opportunity to compete in the emerging and community-based developer set aside, and not necessarily if they don't want to co-partner with someone. So that we have carved out some funds and opportunities that way. So you can do it either way. You can partner with a more experienced developer, get these full points, and go through the competition. But we also have a limited number of funds in the NOFA for emerging developers that are interested in just doing it solo and coming through the system and building up additional experience that way. For the readiness category, very typical of what we have seen in the past with MHP and also somewhat with CIDLAC and TCAC, we did make some changes. So for readiness, we're looking for construction and permanent financing commitments, except for tax credit equity and a bond allocation. For land use approvals and entitlements, we're looking for the local entities to have confirmed that you've gone through some process up to getting ready for pulling your building permits. We did remove the NEPA requirement, the requirement to have NEPA fully done. That's also aligned with what CIDLAC and TCAC have done in the past. We're expecting that with going through the process of getting ready for permanent financing and getting the CIDLAC and TCAC funding, you'll have that NEPA already working in the background so that you're ready by the time you do construction closing. So the expectation is that when you're ready for construction closing, that's when your NEPA will be done, but it doesn't necessarily have to be completely ready by the time you come to HCD for the Supernofa. And we've provided some flexibility for disaster areas. So if you're in a disaster area or disaster impact area, there is some flexibility in terms of the land use entitlement requirements, just recognizing that those areas have a lot going on and may not be able to provide some of the documentation that we are asking for other folks. And then in addition, one of the things that has worked well recently for the multifamily housing program is to ask for the borrower entity to be fully formed. This really helps get the standard agreement executed in a timely manner afterwards. And one of the main things it's trying to alleviate is that when you are ready to do your construction closing, we are not all trying to hurry up and, oh, the standard agreement's not ready, we have to get that done. And now we sort of reopen the review and take a lot of time in terms of, do we have the right organizational documents? Do we have everything that we need so that we can execute the standard agreement? And so we've heard a lot about the rushing and stress that causes. Understanding that fully forming a borrower at the application stage may be slightly onerous or a little bit of a hiccup, but it really is going to save us all time in the long term and stresses during that initial closing phase. So that's one of the priorities there. All right, this next category is quite a mouthful. It's got a lot going on, and so I'm just going to touch on it really briefly. It has several different components. It adds up to 21 points, if I'm remembering right. So most of the options that you see here are 5-point categories, but proximity to amenities is a 6-point category. So in the initial, the infill and adaptive use, we're looking for different parameters in terms of infill and adaptive. The details are in the NOFA, and I encourage you to look at it, but we're really wanting to prioritize those types of areas. For proximity to amenities, aligning with CIDLAC and TCAC, if you're familiar with that, we're looking for proximity to things like transit, grocery stores, schools, libraries, those types of things, and using the same criteria that SIDLAC and TCAC would use, but just doing it in a slightly different way. What those programs are calling a 15-point category, we are calling a 5-point category, but they're equivalent. We're not using a 15-point designation here. However, in addition to that 5 points, we're looking for one additional point, if you're able to, which is close proximity to transit, so a quarter mile. And this part of this is because we've got the IIG component in here, and that is something that has been central to the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program, and so wanted to make sure that as we look to do a universal ranking and rating system and moved as much as we could into thresholds, some of those items that were program specific, we folded those in to this, and this is one example of that. For sustainable building options, we have taken a lot of the components from the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities and the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program. So they already have some robust sustainable options in terms of building. So we've used those, and those are also somewhat aligned with former SIDLAC and TCAC options if you're familiar with those competitions. So we have the usual green building programs, the ones that all are familiar with, LEED, Greenpoint rated. We also have electrification and near electrification points for those areas, just to encourage everyone to be thinking about that. I know that in some geographies that might be a natural, but some geographies it may not. Some geographies may be or have a history of using gas and multifamily. So really looking to continue our emphasis on sustainable building, and so there are quite a few options there for you to choose from what's best for your site. And then broadband access is a new point category for us. We're just looking for wiring to the building. We're not asking you to provide free broadband to the tenants, but just to make sure that there's a minimum level of high-speed broadband available to tenants. Cost containment, we're really focusing on looking at, as was mentioned before, we want to streamline the process, shorten the process, but that will provide a good amount of cost containment, but we also want the system to have in itself some cost containment. So it's a little bit of a convoluted calculation, but if you are familiar with tax credit and bond program, it is identical to the cost containment category that is in the SIDLAC competition. It looks at eligible basis of your project, which is your depreciable costs, and that is in the numerator. And then in the denominator is sort of a standard that has been developed by TCAC, which is meant to be, this is the norm for your type of project in your county, like bedroom mix, location, those components go into your denominator. And you're able to increase your denominator for things like having an elevator, or if you have local impact fees that are impacting your costs. The denominator can be boosted by several different components, and so that will help in the cost containment. As a result of public comment, we had this initially as a 10-point category, but in terms of the different public comments we got, and we did end up reducing this to a 5-point category. And we do understand that this particular measurement, while used by other state housing agencies, may not be the best measurement in all cases and in all counties, so we're absolutely committed to working on thinking about this more. How can we have a better measure of cost containment, and also working with SIDLAC and TCAC to see if we move to a different measurement, they are also interested in doing that as well. So we'll be working on that. And are we doing questions at the end, I think?
Yeah, I think you're probably
We're close. We're close.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, and then last but not least, the tiebreaker. These are our 3 factors, and I know we're getting near the end and we want to have time for questions, so I won't spend too much time on this. It has 3 factors, as I mentioned earlier. The affordability factor. We have weighted average affordability, but we also have some floors to that, so that we are not encouraging a race to the bottom. You cannot receive any score better than a 30% AMI. So we're not asking folks to really commit to like 10 and 15% AMI, which may not be sustainable and may not actually be helpful in some particular areas. So if you have project-based vouchers, if you have rental assistance, you can use the 30% AMI floor for those units. All others, it's a 40% AMI floor. So again, really trying to balance deep affordability, but also operationally sustainable in the long term. The Tiebreaker does have a component for local funding, so we're looking for also a commitment of local funds that will give you competitive advantage in the Tiebreaker, and then additional cost efficiency. So the cost containment that I just mentioned, there's another component of that. If you can go a little bit deeper than that 5-point category, you'll get even more benefit in the Tiebreaker, but this one also has a floor. So trying to balance that some counties and some areas have less control over their costs, and there are different costs throughout the state in geographic regions, and so there is a 25% floor to where you the cost containment component will cease to be a competitive advantage. And then finally, here's our timeline. We have released the NOFA and the guidelines, and we expect to release the Excel application and open that online portal just coming up shortly on April 20th. We're doing testing of our application internally right now, getting ready to release it. In May, we will have webinar and in-person workshops. We're working on finalizing those dates and locations, and so as soon as we have that, we will send a blast out on our website. Plus, the information will be on. We'll send an email blast out, and plus the information will be on our website. So please look for that if you're interested. And we do have our Supernofa email already up there on the website, so ready for any questions that come in. We have staff that are monitoring that, and so we can provide technical assistance that way as well. Application is June 28th. Application deadline is June 28th, and then we're expecting awards in November. So thanks, everyone, and looking forward to it. And now, happy to take any questions. And yes, I'm not sure, do we have a microphone, or feel free to just stand up? Yeah.
Hi, Matt Schauer from Corporate Beers. Just curious about the cost containment. Oh, thank you. Curious about the cost containment scoring and use of eligible basis. This is applicable even for a project that is not contemplating tax credits. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's right. And we're happy to provide assistance in terms of the application itself will have a way to show the eligible basis, and we can always provide technical assistance to a degree on that. But I think our assumption, right or wrong, is that many of the projects that are applying will have experienced developers that have in the past applied to CIDLAC or TCAC, and so are familiar with the concept of eligible basis. So yes, we're not particularly expecting that those projects are going to be applying for tax credits, but in the budget, if they can identify the costs that are eligible basis, that's how the calculation will be done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, John Mims with the Michaels Organization. It sounds like there have been substantial changes to the final guidelines and the scoring from the draft guidelines that you guys released earlier this year or late last year. Is that a fair statement?
I think in some areas there were significant changes. In other areas, tweaks. I don't know if you have any.
I guess.
Yeah, we had almost 1,000 public comments. So we took that very seriously and acknowledged that we may not have hit the nail on the head, and really did take a lot of time to incorporate a lot of that feedback for the final round.
So maybe two clarifications I just wanted based on what I heard today, because I haven't dug into the final guidelines that were released last week, is the consolidated scoring on multiple programs is not in this. Instead, it's just this 113-point scoring system. Is that right? Like versus the 110 plus another 40 for the various programs?
Right, the program-specific scoring is no more, and so the
Okay.
points that we've gone over, those are the only points there are.
Got
And
it.
some of the components that were in those program-specific scoring have now been moved as thresholds. So that content is not necessarily gone, you just may see it in guidelines versus the scoring.
You had mentioned that earlier. And then the last thing in the tiebreaker calculation, that has also shifted a little bit. I think maybe in the last one, I recall maybe there being a priority for homeless or special needs in that tiebreaker, and I see a kind of cap on the kind of weighted affordability. So I just wanted to confirm that that has changed since the draft.
Yes, we did receive a lot of comments about that in particular, and we also watched as CIDLAC was developing their tiebreaker and really continuing to think about long-term alignment across the programs. And so that component that you're mentioning sort of morphed into very similar to what some of the components that are in the CIDLAC tiebreaker, but also we shifted in the state policy priorities. That's a mouthful for me for some reason. Some of those emphasis that you saw in the tiebreaker, you see now in the state policy priorities category.
Jane Barr, Eden Housing, thank you very much for all the work you've done on this. I know it's you had a lot of comments to look at, and you've done your best, and we appreciate it. Yesterday in your session, you said that you were going to do the Supernofa again next year, and I envision this as a funnel with probably 300, 400 balls coming to this very small chute, and things getting backed up. I'm wondering, and yesterday also in a banking workshop, they were worried about their capacity to close all these TCAC loans at the same time following your process starts it. So I'm wondering what your conversations have been with TCAC about this Supernova and the effects it will have on banking institutions and the people closing and the attorneys, et cetera, to get these projects closed to start construction.
You want to take that? I think it's a realistic concern. I mean, I think that there are trade-offs to having the consolidated funding, right? It means that folks are going to be able to do a one and done, but just like every competition, it is competitive, and so not everybody will be awarded. And I think the sort of sporadic nature of having one major competition in an annual cycle is potentially going to increase the competition for the first round of the SELEC and TCAT competitions in 2023, right? Because we will have a bunch of fully funded projects. But we also do have quite a lot of HCD and locally funded projects that are already in the queue for SELEC and TCAT competition, right? And so the folks that are winners out of the Supernofa are by no means the majority of what's going to be coming in for any given SELEC and TCAT competition. So I think maybe the flood that we're imagining is maybe not quite as an extreme a divergence from the current sort of unevenness in any given SELEC or TCAT competition that we see already.
Is that why you extended the period of time for 24 months, recognizing that you extended the period to 24 months, recognizing that not everyone's going to be able to get TCAC first round, they apply, or second round, because there'll be a lot of, you're taking a lot of people in a Supernova and they're all going to TCAC, so you're recognizing that.
I think the recognition is a little broader. It's that every SELEC and TCAT competition is so highly competitive that in any given round, only a portion of those who enter are going to win, regardless of whether we have 1 or 5 HCD competitions over the course of the year. We do see that many of our projects have to go in more than one time to ultimately be successful.
Hi, Rich Wallach with Burbank Housing. I'm really intrigued by the 15% set aside for non-tax credit projects and want to understand a little more about your thinking of what those might look like, particularly around loan limits, because if you're not looking for that big chunk coming from TCAC, how would you look at projects that could be successful?
I think what we've seen in some projects, as Sasha mentioned, I think this could work for smaller. We think this could work for smaller projects, but You tell me. But also, I think there are a certain number of projects that are heavily locally funded. We're not necessarily trying to steer that particularly, but we're trying. This is a start. As was just mentioned, the SILAC and TCAC competitions are very competitive and heavily subscribed, and it seems to be moving. Previously, obviously, when SIDLAC was non-competitive, the 9% program was heavily subscribed. We've seen, very interestingly, this last round, it wasn't very heavily subscribed, and now we're still expecting the 4% to be. And so we're working on looking at how HCD projects can begin to think, is there a way to fill that gap in certain instances? And so we were successful in the most recent MHP round. We did get they had a non-tax credit set aside, and we had funding. And so I think from my perspective, this is just the beginning. We want to see what types of projects come through, and have communications with stakeholders, what might work, how could we tweak things, could there be some addition, in future supernovas, could we make some tweaks that would make it a little bit easier and more accessible for non-tax credit projects to come through. But we do understand that equity is a huge gap filler, but in the interest of moving things along and seeing that some projects can be viable without tax credits, for me, this is a longer-term project. But we've seen some that come through without, and we're going to study those more and see what's viable, and if there's, if we can make tweaks in the future supernovas that encourage that even more, can do that.
And I think we do have an increased allowable per unit loan limit on those non-tax credit properties as well.
From the virtual chat where people are also participating, will these slides be available after the presentation?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. If you share them with
You feel free to email us, but I think we'll get them in the Housing California package as well.
Great, thank you. And another question from the Q&A. Can the Supernofa projects be layered with other HCD funding like No Place Like Home or AHSC? And will there still be a 49% of total units HCD unit cap?
Want me to take that?
Yes, please.
Yes, they may be layered with other HCD funds. The per unit and per project loan limits that we lay out in this NOFA are applicable to prior awards as well as the award that you may get under the Supernofa, as well as awards that you may get from HCD moving forward for 1 year. And so you can have up to 2 loans and 2 grants. They don't need to all come from the Supernofa, but they're not all going to add up to more than the allowable maximum per unit and per project loan limit that we've laid out here. So that would definitely apply to No Place Like Home, AHSC, and a couple of our other smaller programs. What was the other question, part of that question?
Is there still a 49% unit cap?
So Article 34 is still applicable to most of our programs. So in general, yes, I don't want to go too deep into the subtleties because different programs interact with Article 34 a little bit differently. I will say that it's not a cap on the number of affordable units within the project from our perspective. It is a cap on the percentage of the project that we are allowed to fund. And in the case of MHP, we do have a little bit of a workaround that is carried over from prior competitions. It's the same. We fund on all of the units that are 60% AMI or below, even if they are not restricted by HCD. And so although we can only restrict and monitor 49% of those units under MHP, we will fund on the larger category if you are a property that is 100% affordable or 80% affordable.
Good morning, Mary Stomp from PEP Housing. Thank you for changing the experience requirements. It used to be under the MHP program, 5 projects in 10 years, and now it mirrors TCAC, which is great. For those of us that were under the old experience requirements, is there a way to unwind partnerships early when you, when you were approved under the old experience requirements?
Are you thinking that a project that's in existence right now?
Yes. That was approved under the old requirements.
And is it in operation? Are you still
In construction.
Okay, I believe those would still apply since you received competitive scoring, but encourage you to send that question through and our staff can take a look at it and see.
Thank you.
Hi, Veronica Garcia, People Self-Help Housing. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with stakeholders and for taking our comments and concerns, several of them, into consideration. And also, thank you for your recognition of the need to address farmworker housing and veterans before funding MHP and IIG. My two questions are, one, regarding the set aside for community-based developers. Can you speak to the community benefit, clarify or provide examples of what would be a community benefit that's referenced in the language definition for a community-based developer? And then can you also speak to, of the programs that are bundled under AB 434, which programs do you expect to be, I know this is maybe a crystal ball question, but fully done after this round, and which do you expect will come back next year?
For your first question, we are actually finalizing that language now, and so when the application comes out, you will see the details that better describe those parameters in terms of the community benefit program. So we are definitely looking at the public comments we received with suggestions for that, and as we finalize those, but that should come out in the next few weeks. You'll see that information. And then for the second, I think I can speak to that, but Sasha can correct me. The expectation is that the Veterans Housing and Homeless Prevention, this will be the last round for that program. For MHP, we have at least one more round or two. And then IIG is an interesting little animal that has sort of two programs going on at the same time. And so in terms of those two, we expect CERNA, IIG also to be continuing, but I'm not sure of exactly how many rounds.
And we are hoping that we won't have a funding cliff at HCD, right? So I think folks are probably aware that a lot of our bond-funded programs are running out. And I know that there are a lot of folks working to remedy that at the legislative level. And so what we are planning right now for 2024 probably isn't applicable because we hope to see an infusion of general funds or another bond measure before then.
Hey, I'm Dylan Coyle, Clifford Pierce Housing. As I was going through the MHP guidelines, it was unclear to me whether and at what stage you want a market study or an appraisal. The way the language was set up, it seemed to give HCD wide latitude. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Thank you. We did get a comment on that, and thanks for your patience. I know you've been waiting to ask that question for a bit. We are expecting to see a market study in the application, and then for appraisals, I think I'm less familiar with the tenants and the background of MHP, so I don't want to misspeak. But in terms of any times an appraisal is needed to substantiate a value, such as maybe a land donation, we would expect to see that in the application. So in general, the application will speak more specifically and to when an application or an appraisal may be required, but you can also ask that question through the Supernofa mailbox. I think my understanding is that we left ourselves some latitude for those two items because there may be a point at perm closing where things seemed to have changed dramatically, and at that point, if needed be, we may ask for another appraisal or market study. And that I have very little experience with that, but I don't expect that is the norm. But I think that's the reasoning we left that language a little bit vague, as you say, but we want, you're right, it could be requested later, but I think the norm is that those are requested at application and probably in most cases are not requested again after that.
Thank you.
But don't, again, if you have a project-specific question, please send it in. That's a very general response.
Hello, Sean Armstrong with Redwood Energy. Thank you for a very considered and fair effort. I thought that was very impressive. I was curious specifically about gas infrastructure allowance within the infrastructure grants. Is that an allowed expense, as I hear you're also trying to encourage electrification elsewhere in the program?
I don't have the answer to that question, but please send it in and I will get an answer to you. I'm not as familiar with the basics of the IIG program, but I've been working very closely with someone who knows those guidelines inside out, so I think I can get you a question pretty quickly.
My feedback would be I'd encourage you to exclude that as an allowable expense.
Understood. Thank you.
Good morning. David Schnur, Mosaic Urban Development. Thank you for all your work in putting this together. My question concerns the tribal and emerging and community developer set-asides. In the Home Key program, the tribal pool has taken a while to get applications, I think because of the amount of work it takes those applicants as compared to more experienced developers to get applications together. Are you seeing this as a possible outcome of this process, and if so, is there any thought to extending the deadline for the tribal, community, and emerging developer pools?
Would you like to take that? You've been so
Um,
involved in that process.
We are hoping and supporting tribal entities and emerging and community-based developers to be able to put their application together within the window. We have an extended window of 90 days. Approximately 90 days. We're hoping that that will ensure that folks can get their applications in, and we're also providing pre-application consultation, particularly to tribal entities and emerging developers. We are working at potentially having some additional technical assistance to tribal entities through a partner organization. It's not certain yet, but very likely that we'll be able to provide quite substantial technical support for the application process. However, those set-asides will be remerged with the big pot, with the whole general competition if they're undersubscribed at the end of the application window. We do not plan on extending the deadline for tribal applications in the Supernova this time around. We do anticipate that we'll have another set-aside in the next Supernova.
I'm going to go to another question online. Regarding the cost containment calculation, will 9% and non-tax credit projects be able to access the threshold basis boost for deeper affordability in the calculation for adjusted threshold basis limit in the same way that 4% projects can in order to compete on a level playing field?
I don't want to answer that off the top of my head. So the information should be in the language, but I really encourage you to send us that question, and that way I can make sure I give the exact response. Thank you.
Hi, Lieben Shao, Mosaic Urban Development. Want to do a follow-up question to David's. So in the technical assistance work for the tribes, for HCD and Enterprise for Home Key, there have been a number of waivers that the tribes have submitted and that we've assisted them to submit that really address the incompatibility between our mainstream state financing systems and tribal realities, all the way from limiting occupancy to tribal members allowed under the Ahsc Treaty, to the limited resources in terms of local match available to, for example, only state-recognized tribes that are eligible under AB 1010 but don't receive any federal funding. Are there aspects that are going to be integrated into the program through what we've learned from the waiver process?
We've started to do that, and I can answer that question, but if Sasha has anything to add, please do. One of the ways that we integrated that into the guidelines is in terms of the AMI levels, the way that those are measured. So there is the ability for tribes to use a federal or tribally oriented AMI measurement rather than the county level. So where we could, we looked through the guidelines and learned from what we heard from those programs and tried to put it in the guidelines and not need a waiver. So we absolutely expect to receive those waiver requests. And in this first Supernofa, we did as much as we could in terms of the timing that we had to put those in place to alleviate some of those waiver requests. But I think long-term, for more Supernovas, we will continue to look at that as well. And I think this NOFA will be also a learning experience for us for that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Appreciate that effort.
Definitely agree. I think also we don't have a match requirement under this program, but in considering whether or not to change the rules under the NOFA guidelines for tribes, we have to consider two things. One is, are we allowed to according to the program statute, which sometimes we can and sometimes we can't. And so we consulted very intensively with our legal counsel on how much flexibility we had under the existing statute to make the types of accommodations that you're referring to. And in some cases, we can grant a waiver request on a project-specific level, but we can't actually make a blanket exemption in guidelines. So that's one factor. And then the other factor is different tribal entities have different circumstances. And so when you come to something like a match requirement, for instance, right, we wouldn't necessarily want to, at a policy level, grant a blanket exemption to that because there are some tribal entities that would be able to meet that match requirement. So that would, again, be something that even though it could be a trend, it would be something that we would want to assess on a project-by-project basis.
I believe we are at time for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
for
everyone
coming.
very much. Thank you.